Welcome back to Proxam, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to make an effective Craftworld Eldar list in Arks of Omen. So this is something that I've wanted to do for a while, and I have talked about how to make smaller lists as well as how to start a Craftworld Eldar army before, but I really wanted to get into the details about how to build an army list and the thought processes and construction that goes into building that list. So without further ado, let us go ahead and get right into it. So, quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at where to start, choosing Craftworld traits and playstyles. We're going to be talking about how to build a core, which are the key units that the rest of your force will revolve around using. We're going to be talking about choosing, supporting, and utility units. We're going to be talking about the last part of the list building process, which is the army checklist, and asking yourself if you have enough diverse damage dealers and scoring units. And lastly, we're going to be going briefly over playtesting and tweaking your list. So when most players start playing the game and they're trying to choose what Craftworld they want and what units they want, they usually start with the Craftworld traits and their playstyle. So, obviously some people want to play a more fast, aggressive list and want to use more aspect warriors. Other players like the wraiths more and they want to use more tough units in their army. Whatever the case may be, you have to ask yourself the following questions when making a list. And that is, 1, do I want to play a fast and aggressive army with a lot of aspect warriors that can do a high amount of damage? 2, do I want to play a more defensive style army with a lot of support weapons backed up by units that kind of revolve around that? Or 3, do I want to play a tough and grindy army that really wants to get stuck in and then outlast the enemy? And of course, we all know that wraith units are great at that. Or lastly, 4, do I want a mix of the above? And anytime you want to design an army list, you should be asking yourself these questions beforehand so that you have an idea of what units you're going to choose in your list. So for example, if you wanted to do a fast and aggressive style list, you would have to choose between Craftworld traits that benefit that fast and aggressive playstyle. So Swift Strikes is really good with this. Basically, it allows you to advance, shoot, and battle focus in the same turn. It makes you very quick, and you can combine it with another trait, something like Masterful Shots for an additional damage as well. Beal-Tan is also very hard-hitting. Beal-Tan is a very strong Craftworld right now with Aspect Warriors. And they make Aspect Warriors hit much, much harder with the Wrath of the Shrine stratagem, as well as some other kind of things that they like to do. Like, for example, the Warlord trait as well is basically a second guide. Hail of Doom is also very strong, and again, Hail of Doom's been pretty much strong forever, but Hail of Doom does do a lot of damage with shuriken weapons, and your army will be basically based around that factor. And lastly, of course, we have the Samhain, which, although aren't the most competitive Craftworld by any means, their Shining Spears can make you turn 1 charge. So that could be something that could throw off your opponents. And if you really like Shining Spears and you want to get a bunch of those, Samhain is probably the way to go for that list. Or if you wanted to go a different direction and choose a more defensive and denial-based list, Uthway makes great use of support weapons, which are the ultimate denial tool, right? D-cannons are super powerful. No one wants to get in their range. And also, Uthway has a lot of great defensive tools, which help it with that defensive and denial-based strategy. We also have the Alatok, which gets great cover bonuses and is really good at misdirecting enemies, preventing charges and things like that with rangers and controlling the board that way. If you were thinking about a more tough and grindy style of list, Uthway is also good with this with Wraith units because they have great defensive traits, with a 5+ ignores mortal wounds, and of course a 6+ invul army-wide. And they also get a psychic bonus, and of course that's important because we have a lot of defensive psychic powers which help Wraith units survive even longer. Warding Runes basically does the same thing. It has a 6+ invul and gives your army a 5+ ignores mortal wounds, but you can choose another trait. You can choose things like Masters of Concealment for army-wide light cover as well. And if you want to go the lore route, Iyanden isn't, again, the most competitive Craftworld, but it does get an AP reduction army-wide against AP-1 and AP-2 attacks. So you're going to be a little bit more durable against those light-armed infantry fire. So now we're going to talk about building a core, which is basically a group of key units that the rest of your force will revolve around using. And this group of units is going to form the backbone of your army. And again, these should be units that synergize well with your Craftworld traits and, of course, your play style. So, for example, this could mean using Dire Avengers in BL10 and Hail of Doom lists, because Dire Avengers have a solid damage profile, right? Strength 4, AP -2 weapons with the Shuriken proc, which gives it additional AP, is a great way to use the Wrath of the Shrine stratagem, as well as synergize with Hail of Doom, which of course, if, for those of you guys who don't know out there, Hail of Doom for every 6 you roll to hit, auto wounds on a 6, which gives you additional AP as well. If you're running a Swift Strikes list, Shroud Runners are basically a necessity in my opinion, because they get to move 16 inches, auto advance 6 inches, which puts them up to 22 inches. They get to shoot, and then they get to use Battle Focus to run back. So it's a very powerful trait. It makes them very fast and deadly and able to get angles on enemy units that your opponent will not expect. Then we have support weapons. D-cannons are really great in Uthway or Laytok for denying board space. And honestly, the Shadow Weavers are pretty good too for killing units that are out of line of sight, things like Gretchen or Imperial Guard, who are hiding and camping on objectives. And lastly, we have Wraith units. So Wraith units are very good in Warding Runes lists or Iandan lists, although Uthway can do this too, which is why Uthway is such a strong faction in my opinion. It can kind of do a lot of things really well, but basically Wraith units are going to be the core of your force in these types of lists. So after you're done choosing the core group of units that your army is going to revolve around, you need to choose supporting and utility units to back them up. And these are basically going to be units that can cover their weaknesses and also score on objectives. And again, this allows the backbone units of your army the freedom to engage enemies and deal massive damage, right? You don't want to be using a unit of 5 Wraith Blades, for example, to sit on a back objective all game. You need cheaper units to do that because those Wraith Blades are expensive and they're not really doing much for you just sitting in the backfield. So what are some examples of these types of units? So Vipers, Rangers, and of course minimum units of Wind Riders all make good screeners and objective scores because they are cheap and expendable. Vipers base are only 40 points, Rangers come up to 65 and can advance position so they can get into a good position to screen or block enemy units from getting to objectives. And also minimum units of Wind Riders are only 60 points and also make good objective scores as well. Shroud Runners are also good disruption units and harassers. They can harass enemy units from afar and then get back behind cover very quickly. Wraith Lords provide a good deterrent, as do Howling Banshees. Again, Howling Banshees are there to cover the weaknesses of some of your other units because they can basically do an extreme amount of damage to harder targets. And also, lastly, Warlocks and Farseers provide psychic support, buffing your units, and also debuffing enemy units. So once you have all those units in place and you've written your army list, it's time to do the army checklist. So you have to ask yourself, do I have diverse damage dealers and scoring units? And lastly, you want to make sure that your army can handle a wide variety of opponents and units. Again, you want to make sure you have resources to deal with not only infantry, but also vehicles and monsters. And do you have the tools to deal with both hordes and elite infantry, right? And trust me, I'm not knocking scatter lasers at all, but if you're going against something like a Imperial Knight list, those scatter lasers are just not going to do as much damage as against other forces. They're not going to be as efficient. So you do want to make sure you have tools for both vehicles, infantry, all types of infantry, I should say, and monsters as well. And lastly, did you include units designed to score on objectives and support your forces? So these are going to be the units like Farseers, Warlocks, minimum units of Wind Riders or Vipers and things like that that are just meant to, score on objectives, get things like behind enemy lines and stuff like that, and not have to worry too much about dealing damage. So especially with Craftworld Eldar, it's really important that you build a list in which every single unit in your army has a task assigned to it, right? Whether that be to score on objectives, to kill enemy units, or honestly just to support the rest of your forces and help them do a better job at what their task is. Okay, so once you've gone through the checklist and everything is looking great and you're happy with your list, the next step is playtesting and tweaking. So from here, really all that's left to do is test your army out on the field of battle. Now that seems easier said than done, right? A lot of you, like me, honestly, in the past, very busy and don't have a lot of time for games. Luckily, now I do have a little bit more time to do that, but in the past, I was busy. I was going to school, I was working, I didn't have a lot of time. And usually when this happens, you may not have time for a bunch of playtesting, right? But an important factor to note is that even before you play a game, you should be getting a feel for your list first. And you might want to set up your army a couple times at home on your table and run it through a few turns to get an idea of how fast it moves and what it can target on the other side of the battlefield. And, I know that sounds kind of lame, but everybody does it. You have to get a feel for the look of your army because this isn't like a video game, right? Where you can just kind of see something on a screen before you. You really do have to set up your forces and kind of get an idea of what's in your army list when you play a game and familiarize yourself with it. And that way, you'll at least know what you're going to do for the first few turns of the game when there's not a lot going on, A lot of obscuring terrain is in the game. Again, your opponent's forces may not have line of sight to a lot of your units. So this is a good opportunity in the first few turns to kind of have a battle plan to see what you're going to do in the beginning. Because a lot of games for Craftworld Eldar, believe it or not, are lost within the first couple of turns. Because players make mistakes or didn't plan for a certain outcome or something like that, right? And a lot of times what it is, to be honest with you guys, is when you're up against something you don't know how to tackle properly, you play more defensive. And this could be the case even with a very aggressive and fast list. So if you don't know what you're going to do in the first few turns of a game, that can oftentimes cost you big time. Especially with Craftworld Eldar. Again, we're a very hard army to play. Not a lot of players are aware of how truly difficult Craftworld Eldar is to play when you're first starting out. And honestly, I've said this on the channel before, but when I first started playing Eldar way back in the day, I lost basically every game for like 20 or something games. I mean, it was it was pretty insane. I don't know how I continued, to be honest, but I just loved the army so much I was willing to lose with it. And when I finally started to improve with the army, it started to become a lot better. So for those of you out there who are really struggling with the Craftworld Eldar, be patient. Your time will come. You'll kind of learn more and more as it goes on. You'll learn more tricks, more ways to keep your army alive and position yourself better so that you have a much more successful time in a game. All right, so before we go today, I do want to give you guys an example of a Hail of Doom list that I've tweaked for Arks of Omen to illustrate the list building process. And of course, this isn't the only way to build a list. I know a lot of players out there have different ways to do it and have been successful with their own methods, and that's awesome. This is just the way that I found most constructive and simple to use for me. That's all. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into how I start a list. So I start a list by building the core of the army. So I'll have a list here, and for example, Hail of Doom, the core of the army I want to be revolving around Dire Avengers. So Dire Avengers are going to be the main core of this list. I also have 5 Wind Riders here as well to provide additional damage. So I have 10 Dire Avengers, the Exarch has Shuriken Catapults. I have 10 more that also have Shuriken Catapults, and then I have 5 Wind Riders with Shuriken Catapults. And this is basically where the most damage is going to be coming from, right? These are the units that are going to be buffed with Guide, going to be benefiting from Doom and Jinx and things like that to really amp up their damage to a seriously considerable level. As for the army's utility units, I have a Viper with a Shuriken Cannon, which is just meant to, capture objectives, screen enemy units, score on, secondaries if it has to, right? Things like behind enemy lines and stuff like that. I have 3 Shroud Runners, which are also a great utility unit in pretty much every list because they have advanced move and because they have the Wireweave Grenade stratagem, which can prevent charges. I have 5 Rangers for advanced deployment, protection, and screening. And I have 2 Warlock Skyrunners, one with Protect and Jinx, and one with Quicken and Reveal. So this combo is typically seen in Eldar lists for the secondary Warp Ritual, so this helps me score on objectives, but it also gives me an option to use Reveal, right, if I need to do a little bit more damage to a unit that's in cover, and Jinx as well to negate enemy armor. So the thing about this combination that I think is different than in my Uthway list is that I may or may not take Warp Ritual in a game just depending on the matchup. So if I'm going against something that I know can deny my psychic powers relatively easily, and because I don't have a +1 bonus like I do in my Uthway list and things like that, there may be times where I don't take War Patrol, right? But that makes it so that these Warlocks can still be useful, right? Having Jinx and Reveal are still very powerful psychic abilities that will help you against pretty much any army. And then we come to the army's support. So these are units that are basically designed to deal with whatever the core of my list cannot deal with by themselves. So I have 5 Fire Dragons, which are 120 points. These are just there to crack open heavy tanks and deal severe damage so that my Dire Avengers don't need to do it. And yes, Dire Avengers in a Hail of Doom list can kill even a Land Raider with buffs and debuffs, but to be honest with you, it's not quite cost effective. Because it does take a lot of energy to, pump Doom into it, guide your Dire Avengers and do all that, and that's not always going to work. So again, especially if your opponent has things like Psychic Denial that can deny your psychic powers, or you fail your psychic power, which definitely can happen, right? Even though we're Eldar, we have a greater chance of succeeding. We're not immune to failing psychic abilities. So I have 5 Fire Dragons there for big stuff. We also have 5 Howling Banshees. And of course, like always, the Exarch has the Mirror Swords and Piercing Strikes abilities, or weapons and ability, I should say. And this is basically just, again, for taking out tough targets and eliminating something from the game, but also to have a combat presence to protect your Dire Avengers from close combat. We also have 3 support weapons with D-Cannons. These are to give you a backfield presence and give you a little bit of an area of denial so that your opponent can't easily swing around your flank and hit you where it hurts without suffering a lot of damage in retaliation. And again, D-Cannons are just a very good general unit for killing big stuff that maybe your Dire Avengers don't want to deal with, right? And I've actually found that Dire Avengers, believe it or not, are much better at just dealing with heavy infantry than tanks anyway. Yeah, they can kill tanks, absolutely, with Hail of Doom. But do they want to? No, right? Because your other units are what's going to be dealing with that. Dire Avengers typically want to take out infantry. We also have 2 Wave Serpents, which one is carrying a unit of Dire Avengers, the other Dire Avenger unit is going to go in reserve. And 1 Wave Serpent is carrying a unit of Howling Banshees and a unit of Fire Dragons. We have Baharoth for objective ability. He has objective secured. He can score on things like behind enemy lines very easily. And he's just very slippery in general and hard to take out. We have a Farseer Skyrunner with Executioner, Doom, the Kernus Bow, and Mark of the Incomparable Hunter. And his job is just to basically take out anything my Dire Avengers, Fire Dragons, and any other unit in my army might have trouble with. So maybe units with a high invul save, or maybe units that have, a demonic save. He's there to kind of pick up the slack. I also have a Farseer with Guide and Faithful Divergence. Faithful Divergence just to give a little bit more command point support, of course, and Guide to reroll hits. And that's basically it. So I have the core of my army being the 2 Dire Avenger units and the Wind Riders being very high damage dealing units with a lot of shuriken power, which Hail of Doom lists really want. I have my utility, which is designed to score on objectives and screen. So I have my Viper, I have my Shroud Runners. I even have my Rangers as well, who can use their advanced positions to support my army and make sure I don't get jumped on by a lot of advanced deployment. And I also have my 2 Warlocks who can either support with their psychic powers or score on Warp Ritual. And then lastly, for the army support, I have units that, basically help the rest of the army out, right? Deal with things that they can't normally deal with or help them perform their jobs better. So Wave Serpents, Baharoth, who is kind of weird because he's kind of in both categories. He's kind of both in the support and the utility category because he's just really awesome in Hail of Doom lists, honestly. He gives a lot to the army. And then, of course, I have my Farseers who also help support the army where they're, might have some trouble. So, in conclusion, building a balanced list can be a little bit intimidating as there are so many things to take into account when doing it. However, if you break it down in an easy-to-digest way, it can be extremely fun and simple, leaving you more time to play and maybe to paint too. I honestly really need to get to my painting. I have the first game of my Escalation League at the end of this month, and I still need to paint another Viper up, and I still need to paint my Dire Avengers, which I'm being extremely lazy about, so I do need to do that. Because we're trying to get the Escalation done before 10th edition, in June, so we're actually going to be starting at the end of this month instead of in the summer like we originally planned. So I'm going to have to do that. And then because there was changes to the force organization, I had to change up my list a little bit from what it originally was to be able to fit. So yeah, that was a little bit unfortunate, but I'm hoping to get that done by the end of the month. And then I will be posting the results on my channel so you can see how I did in my first 500 point escalation match, which we're going to have quite a few games over the next couple months. So I'm thinking of just making that like a weekly thing for you guys, or maybe a bi-weekly thing where I post the results of a couple of matches that I've played. And yeah, we'll kind of see how it goes. I want to also at some point next week kind of explain the rules of the Escalation League to you guys, as well as, kind of provide you guys the normal content. What else do we got coming up? Well, we have a video coming up on how to fight against Tau, which should be a good one. I finally convinced my buddy in the gaming group that plays Tau to bring out his old army. Again, he's very rusty with them. He hasn't played them in over, one edition. The last time I think he played them was in 8th edition. So he's probably going to be a little rusty, but I finally convinced him to bring them out. I said, hey, they're really good now, And he said that he would give them whirl and bust them out again. So he is rusty, though, so I don't know how great those first couple games are going to be, but we'll see. He said he wanted to play a few games with them and kind of help me out, so I appreciate that. So I'll be going ahead and kind of telling you guys what my thoughts are on Tau probably next week. And then I also have a video coming up on Arks of Omen secondary objectives. I want to kind of go over those again and talk to you a little bit about the importance of objective security in Arks of Omen and stuff like that. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Have a great day, everybody. Have a great weekend filled with great games. I will see you guys next time. And as always, thank you so much for the support. I know those of you who have supported me on Patreon and PayPal, thank you again for your support. It really helps the channel out. And as always, I will leave those links in the description for those of you who want to support the channel a little bit further. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I will see you guys next time. Have a good one. Peace out, everybody. See you later.